Max Gorlin, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Nat Fyfe from the Fremantle Footy Club.
Trent Cotchin from the Richmond Footy Club.
Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Patrick Cooch from the Carlton Footy Club.
It's Rory Sloane here from the Adelaide Crows.
This is Tom Mitchell. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Hey friends, you got MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you're well and welcome back to another episode of the 50 Most Relevant, where through the first 50 days of 2023, I count down with you who I believe are the most relevant players across SuperCoach, DreamTeam and AFL Fantasy. Throughout the preseason, we always have different people on these episodes. Some of them are guests from across the fantasy footy community. Others are members of the Coaches Panel. A new member that you're going to get to know very, very well in 2023 is MiniMonk. Hello, mate. How are you?
Yeah, not going too badly. How about yourself?
Yes, I'm good. I'm keeping out of trouble because all I'm doing is writing about fantasy football throughout the month of January. On today's episode, in at number 42, we're talking about Western Bulldog Bailey Smith. Just the 22 years of age is the midfielder, and his top score last year in AFL Fantasy is also his career high score. It's a 154 against the Demons. It came all the way back in round one, while it was a 144 in SuperCoach against the Magpies, which was his top score for the year. It's not quite, though, in that format. His career high score, he's got a 150 against the Crows back in the COVID-affected 2020 season. From an average perspective, he delivered a pretty handy year in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. A 105.6 in Fantasy and Dream Team, which means in those two formats, he's going to set you back just a touch over 950,000 in DT and 935K in AFL Fantasy. While in SuperCoach, an average of 98.6 has got him at the price point of 542,700. And MiniMonk, Bailey came from that super draft of 2018. The King brothers, Walsh, Rankin, Rosie and Butters. And it's crazy in just a handful of seasons how all of them, but especially Bailey, has established themselves as a real star of the competition.
Yeah, I mean, Bailey Smith he's burst onto the scene. He's been a phenomenal player for the Dogs. He does it all. He plays inside, he plays outside. He can get the ball damaging inside 50. He's a workhorse. He plays, 90% time on ground. He's just a great player to watch as well.
And you gloss over that 90% time on ground so easily, but maybe it's unfair. But you think of someone like a Matt Crouch and his points per minute as a player. It was always man, he could always be this next tier of player if he could just stay on the ground a little bit longer. But it's because of Bailey Smith's high-end work rate, incredible fitness, amazing endurance, that we've got this guy who still has not yet played 100 games of AFL footy, delivering incredibly well for us. If we dive into his 2022 numbers a little bit to see what he delivered us, there was that top career score all the way back in round one that really put people to attention around him, that 154 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. But by the end of the 2022 season, he'd scored 11 tons in that format from his 16 matches. It included that 154, but also a 131 and a 147. So there's some nice ceiling about him there. A bunch of other scores 90 plus, and he only fell under 90 in 3 occasions last year. So 81% of games last year, scores of 92 or above. That average of 105.6 actually has him ranked as the 10th best pure midfielder. That's just a crazy effort when you think about it. He's in MiniMonk. It's ahead of McRae, Walsh, Kelly, Bont, McCluggage, Petrarca, and Patrick Cripps. That's a phenomenal season in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team.
Yeah, and it's a huge average to have, and it's bolstered him by the fact that, the last game of the season, he was tagged and quite heavily. Like, he was on 40 odd at half time, even less. And the other game, one of the other games he was sub 90 was, when he had that nasty, I think got suspended.
Yeah, there was that head clash game against Zach Tui, where he really struggled to get into the game after being tagged, and then really wasn't himself from then point on after that headbutt against Zach Tui. We'll talk about that in a minute. In SuperCoach, season probably wasn't as prolific, but the highlights are still very, very good. His average of 98.6 consisted of 6 tons. All of them were over 110, by the way, and 3 of them were over 135. And just like in AF and DT, a really nice ceiling with just a handful of games, 3 in fact, under 80, and 2 of those were against the Cats. So they certainly seem to get his number a little bit there. But what I noticed, MiniMonk, when we kind of break down Bailey Smith's season, we see a really interesting trend. There was what he delivered between round 1 and 10, and then what happened from round 12 onwards till the end of the year. Now, remember, there's a big chunk of games he missed in the back half of the year due to the on-field incident where he headbutted Zach Tuin. He missed a bunch of games. And then there was the off-field indiscretion, which immediately after that it continued that suspension a little longer. But between rounds 1 and 10 in SuperCoach, he averaged 112.2, while in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam, in that same stretch of 9 games, 118. Elite numbers. In the final few games of the year between round 12 and 23, an average of 81 in SuperCoach, while it was just 89 in DT and AF. So I suppose, MiniMonk, it depends how you want to view those numbers, but the upside there of what he did in those first 9 games, gosh, that puts him in the top tier of players in the conversation.
It puts him in the top 8 midfielders if you can average 118 over a 10-game stretch.
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that all of those sub-90 games in AFL Fantasy and a lot of those poorer scores in SuperCoach came in the back half of that season.
They did.
And I think that that's an important distinction to make. I mean, you've got on-field and off-field discretions. You're going to affect he's had mental health issues associated with that. True. And then he got to hard tag in that last round as well. But that might mean he's just comes in at a really nice price for us in SuperCoach and AFL Fantasy based on, what he's been able to perform at. He jumped in his average from last year to this year in AFL Fantasy by 18 points per game, which is, a huge increase. And in SuperCoach, I think it was, about 14 or 15 points per game, which is, wild for some.
What do you think was some of the cause of that? I know sometimes we talk about the 3rd-year breakout and the 4th-year establishment as a premium. From the data, what do you think you can kind of pinpoint as one of the key reasons for the big scoring jump for Bailey Smith?
I think this is the one that I lightly mentioned before, but his time on ground.
Yeah.
His time on ground average in those first 10 rounds was, 95%, which is phenomenal. Like you don't see midfielders playing 95% time on ground very often. And the ones that do, you don't have to score at a high points per minute if you're spending, almost all of the game on the ground. Yeah. And that's another thing that was, different between the first 10 rounds to the back half of the season. His time on ground actually dropped. It went down to about 85% over that last little bit, which, explains a little bit of his decrease in scoring as well. But, another preseason under his belt, gets fitter, more opportunities are in place. I can't see that time on ground dropping, which means, he might have the ability to go at that 110 to 115 in AFL Fantasy and 105 to 110 in SuperCoach for an entire season as opposed to just half of one.
Yeah, no. And look, sometimes people will go, well, split the difference and go somewhere in the middle. And that's what he'll be. And let's go, okay, well, that's what he's priced at for you. So, but again, a 4th-year player, this is often the year that a player really establishes themselves after 4 and 5 seasons as who they really are. And definitely Bailey Smith, if he's not there already, he is on the cusp of being not just one of the best players in the competition, as David King said on SEN at the start of 2022, but he's right in that conversation for fantasy football coaches. And man, one game can make such an incredible difference in your relevance in fantasy footy. And it was the Bulldogs game against the Dockers in the finals that Fantasy Freako, which is the Twitter handle connected to Champion Data, said that he had 85% of the game in the midfield. It was a season high from him. And as a result, that meant he missed out on retaining his mid-forward DPP status by 0.6. I suppose, MiniMonk, there's upsides and downsides to that. The downside is we've probably lost a top 10 player in the 50 most relevant. The upside is positive, unique, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, definitely a unique. If you had, Dunkley, Smith, Taranto, Cornelio, Rosie, Butters, all these players with forward status coming into 2023, it would have been really, really hard to squeeze, 3 or 4 of those into your forward line. But now you can, potentially pivot, pick him as a midfielder as opposed to some of the other more common options. And there is always that potential that he picks up DPP through the season like he did in 2022.
Yeah. And again, where his prolific scores came last year at the front half a dozen games of the year is how he picked up his scoring and how he
Yeah.
picked up his DPP. So let's talk about his role. A lot of people will have an assumption that Hunter's out. Now, he didn't play a heap of games last year, but sure, there's a freed up wing and there's a freed up mid and forward rotation with Dunkley. Do you believe that means Bailey Smith rolls straight into that centre bounce midfield? Because he only attended about 50%, 54% of CBAs last year. Outside of that final, nothing over 65%. Do you see him just rolling straight into the guts and being alongside Libba, Bont and McRae? Or do you see something a little bit different to what he's been doing?
I think when you've got, as you said, the likes of Libba, Bont, McRae in a CBA rotation, they're all real tough nuts. They've got, great contested possession, great first touch and clearance rates. I think you can use Bailey Smith as a burst player in the midfield every now and then, but I think he, will maintain a fairly similar role, a fairly similar split between centre bounces and wing, maybe 50-50, maybe a little bit higher on the wing. But I don't think that that's a detractor for him. I think that, he's shown the ability to be able to score with a lot of time on the wing just because he runs hard. He gets to the space, He finds the ball. And when he gets gets that time in the midfield, he can show his, tackling and pressure, which is good. You want a player that can, push in and also push out. You need the players that work on both inside and outside to be a really elite fantasy scorer.
Yeah, I agree. He's a perfect second touch player. And what I mean by that is you've got guys like Liberatore is elite at this. Bontempelli and McRae are also very, very good at this. Is they excel at getting the ball from stoppage, getting it away from a clearance perspective. And Bailey can do that. You mentioned earlier in the podcast, he's really that modern day elite all-round midfielder. But where he excels is using that speed, that power, that endurance to create space and separation from opposition to set up those forward 50 movements for the Bulldogs. And that's where he's at his best for their side. So I think he's going to stay, like you, in that second touch role, still with plenty of centre bounce moments, but wing, high half forward, becoming that fourth, fifth, sixth midfielder at the contest. I think that's where he's going to be best suited. And also for fantasy coaches, that's where he'll be at his best. Through the 50 most relevant, you may have noticed that we've already talked about it with Rids a little bit earlier with certain players have more relevance in different formats than others. Mitch Duncan, when we did him earlier in the 50, probably more suited to AFL Fantasy and Dream Team the day or two before. Ben Cunnington, probably a little bit more suited to SuperCoach. So through the 50 most relevant, because we cover all formats, you'll see certain players higher or lower in the 50 due to their favorability of relevance to different formats. Now, Bailey Smith is very, very relevant in SuperCoach. I think he's more relevant in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. Where I think he might get hurt a little bit in that format of SuperCoach is you're not punished or rewarded for how you distribute the football. Last year, Smith was ranked first in the league for turnovers and 12th for clangers. So he certainly can clean that up. He's only been in the AFL system for 4 years, absolutely. But it's for that reason I go, man, you could start him anywhere. You could look to upgrade him anywhere. But AFL Fantasy and Dream Team MiniMonk is probably the format I think people will be more likely to consider him as a starting squad option.
Yeah, I think so as well. I've personally looked at him in drafts in Dream Team and in AFL Fantasy. I don't really want to touch him to start the year in SuperCoach. If he shows that he can clean up, that disposal efficiency and isn't a clanger type player anymore, then yeah, it might be a good price to jump on it. But you'd need to see a few weeks of that before you could really jump into it. But I think in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, he's in that really tight knit bunch of players. There's a lot of players in that 900k, low 900k price bracket where you can go, right, which one do I want to jump on? Have they got the better run to start the year? Have they got the more upside based off of injuries or tags during the year? Is there more opportunity for them to be able to score through the year? He's one that you could pick in those formats as a point of difference, because I don't see many people talking about him at all online. No. Like he's not in people's draft teams. He's not, anywhere. And yet he has the ability to be a top 8 midfielder and go at, 115 for a continued stretch of time. I mean, you only have to look to last year where after round 1, everyone was like, oh my God, he's popped to 150. Yeah. How do I get this guy into my team?
100%. Remember the first 9 games of the year, a 118 is what he was going at in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. I think you're right. I think people are looking just in AFL Fantasy for a second, and it's probably similar parallels to DT. They see a McRae who's 19,000 cheaper, a Petrarca 27K cheaper. Josh Kelly, yeah, I had to get him into the 50 somehow, who's 37,000 cheaper. Even a Darcy Parish who's 47K cheaper. People, yes, you can of course get multiples of these, but I think where people are going, oh, this sub 930 range to 900 to 890, oh, I can really only get one. So I think that backs up your point, is that they'll go for guys that might be a little more tried, tested, and proven over a longer period rather than Smith. But again, like we said, with the not holding the DPP, that can only be a positive upside for those that are bullish, that have seen the scoring ceiling, that have seen the upside. Because for me, I don't know about you, MiniMonk, if someone came to me at the end of the year and said, did you know Bailey Smith was the top scoring AFL fantasy player of the season? I wouldn't look shocked at them. I'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Would that freak you out if someone made that statement?
No, I think you just need to look at it. I mean, he would have been up there as one of the top scoring AFL fantasy players to start the season. And,
yeah,
you know, he's shown the ability and he's got the tank to be able to push it out for an entire season. I think you could easily make an argument that he could be, if not a top 8, maybe the top, 3-2 top midfielder for the year.
Yeah.
And the other thing is you're not picking him. If you're not picking him to start the season, that doesn't mean you don't have to own him, because you'll always stay relevant. Like,
It's true.
especially if he picks up DPP through the year, which is
Oh
always in the realm of possibility for a player that, plays a similar role to what Dunkley does. You get midfield rotation, then you push forward off of that, and you just have to see that, like, he got it last year. That means that he's always going to be a relevant player, and definitely someone you will consider at some point in the season.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice commentary, so that even if you're not got Bailey Smith in your starting squad, you are monitoring him right throughout the preseason, right throughout those early rounds, whether it be for the scoring pop that we saw at the start of the year, whether or not we see the gaining of DPP heading into round 6, 12, or 18. It will be fascinating to see just how many people jump on Bailey Smith in 2023. Before we wrap up the podcast, we've got to talk about where he goes on draft day. He's currently ranked as the 10th best midfielder in Dream Team and Fantasy for averages heading into 2023, while he's ranked 29th midfielder in SuperCoach. MiniMonk, where do you see him going across these two formats on draft day?
I think in AFL Fantasy, most people would either want him as like a really, really late M1, or probably more likely an early M2. Yeah. I think, people view a few other midfielders going past him who might regress to, say, 13th or 14th midfielder. I think there's an argument he could still be top 10.
Yep.
But I see him probably going in the late second, early third round. Pair him up with a nice forward that you get early on in the first round, or pair him up with another midfielder that can pop a 115, 120 average and be your captaincy option every week. And then in SuperCoach, he goes a few rounds further back, and that is probably an M3, M4-ish range nearly, probably M3.
Yeah,
and that's probably about 5th or 6th round, depending on how your draft goes.
Yeah, no, I love that, mate. I totally agree with that take. Hey, man, not a bad debut in the 50 most relevant for you, MiniMonk. Thanks for your work today.
No, thanks for having me. It's a really, really good time to be able to chat about a relevant fantasy player who, might be a point of difference for the season. You never know.
Yeah, 100%. If you want to go and check out the article on Bailey, it is online for you now, coachespanel.tv. MiniMonk's also done a little team reveal a few weeks back when the early access was granted to some of the formats. If you want to go and check those out, you can see some of his initial selections over at coachespanel.tv. In 30 seconds, I'm going to give you a clue about who's at number 41 in the 50 most relevant. But if you are loving this podcast series so far, make sure you're following it across wherever you're getting this podcast and listening from right now. Make sure you follow, leave a nice 5-star rating and review. And if you love what you're getting from the Coaches Panel so far in 2023, I'd love you to become a Patreon supporter. It helps us do what we do every single day for you in the season, but also we'll give you some additional rewards and exclusive content, extra access to a bunch of different things just for becoming a supporter. And we'll even give you these podcasts 24 hours early. So you're on 42 with Bailey. They already know who's at number 41. So who is it? They had a career high in multiple categories. So good that they were one of the most talked about players in 2022. And yet, as we enter the new season, after all the accolades and praise that they garnered last year, I've barely seen him in a team picker. I've barely seen anybody in the fantasy community consider him. But regardless, he was so good last year and he's been so good for so long. To discount him is a crime, a fantasy crime. Who is it? I'll tell you tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.
Give it up, give it up.